I did want to remind people. I wanted to remind you yesterday, and then I forgot. Please don't forget to do the teacher evaluations. They should be open as of yesterday. I didn't check because I can't, but they should be open. Um, you're nodding yes because you've already done it. Yeah, that's fine. It's okay if you did. Like, good for you. I encourage you to do it as soon as possible. It's one of the disadvantages of doing it online. It's kind of like out of sight, out of mind type of thing. But it does actually help, not just for me knowing right your comments, because sometimes people don't say them in person, and I totally understand that. But it also genuinely helps for later. So, in case you don't know, sometimes if I do apply to other jobs in universities, they ask for student evaluations, right? Whether positive or negative. So, they do actually help for other things, right? Um, so you don't have to do them right now, but just please don't forget. I don't know when it closes, if it closes at some point. So, all right. I didn't even open up the PowerPoint yet. So that'll be a strong start, ladies and gentlemen. All right. ML.
Hey.
So,
Sorry. Didn't realize I was late.
Oh, good. I was like this. I saw her earlier. It's impossible that
I was in a flow,
That's okay. Yep. You managed to vibrate the essay you were writing.
Like the first big chunk of it.
Okay, so how many of you managed to read the excerpt for Obasan for today? Yeah? Good. Awesome. Aha! Should have waited that extra 2 minutes just to really give everyone time to arrive. Yeah, so for those of you who are late, the only thing I've said so far is please don't forget to do the teacher evaluations. They opened up yesterday. I forgot to give the reminder. So please do that. It is important, both for me and institutionally. All right, so for today, what the plan is, obviously talking about the excerpt of Obasan, but more specifically, I wanted to give a little bit of background on Japanese Canadians in Canada, do a brief detour through a Roy Mickey poem, and that will make sense in due time, and then talk more explicitly about Obasan as a text, with special attention to the way that it constructs its narrative and how it starts to fit in, or how it does fit in with other elements of stories that we've talked about in this semester, which is something, of course, that we're going to do more fully tomorrow with Dion Brand's poem, or long poem, Inventory. So what I want to do, and this is mostly an experiment more than anything else, you're not evaluated for this activity in any way, shape, or form. This is not worth an extra 5% or anything like that. I'm purely doing this because one of the topics that we've been discussing here and there throughout the class is the way in which stories are structured, right? And the way in which early parts of the novel or poem that we're discussing, or even the play that we've discussed, if the writer is doing a good job, tend to set up both thematically and action-wise what will happen in the novel, whether we're aware of it or not, okay? Or whether we're actively paying attention to that or not. So instead of lecturing at you for a few minutes, I want to take, we'll say 10 minutes just to be generous, right? 5 to 10 minutes. And I would like you to consider what you think the rest of the novel would be about, right? Because I only gave you the first 20 pages, 17 pages, okay, of the novel, and it is in sequence. Okay, I didn't skip anything. Based off of what you read, where do you think the story is going? Okay, I would argue that at least thematically and even in some of the imagery that is demonstrated in the novel, you should get a sense of what it's about, even if it's not explicitly said. Okay? You can write this down. You can just think about it. You can do it with someone if you want. Right? I don't care. I want you to just think about it, and then in a few minutes, I'll ask you to share. And over the course of today's class, we can reference some of those elements if they come up in the conversation. Does that make sense for everyone? All right, fantastic. Take a few minutes, and then I'll check back in. Check back in a few minutes. Okay. So don't worry if you haven't gone through every single point that you wanted. Again, it's purely for an introductory exercise or a thought exercise here. So who would like to give me, it doesn't have to be every one of your ideas, but some ideas of where they think the novel would go if you had kept reading?
Mine was at the very end. What kind of spoke out to me was when Aunt Emily stayed back.
Okay. What does that signify to you?
Like she came back to help with the family. Because she got her education, but she didn't go get a job. She couldn't get a job, and she stayed back and helped with the family. But how would it turn if she actually got a job and she left?
Okay, so in the beginning, right, when they mentioned that Aunt Emily stayed back, that to you at the end would turn into she gets an actual job in her field. Oh, okay, sorry, I misunderstood that. Okay. So Aunt Emily. No, it's fine. Right, we'll come back to Aunt Emily as a character, even though she doesn't appear that much in the excerpt that I gave you. Right, so it goes from Aunt E staying back, or stays behind to help, into she frees herself, right? Or not necessarily frees herself. I wouldn't necessarily say that she's a prisoner, but gets a little bit more independence in that sense. Good. I'm not going to tell you just yet whether that's true or not. You're going to have to read the book. But again, just for the purposes of the exercise here. What else did we come up with, or did we think of?
Like something that's going to happen.
Yeah, if you were going to read the rest of it, where do you think it's going to go just based off of what you read so far for today? When you say she, you mean Naomi, I assume? Okay. Good. We'll come back to that. Yeah.
The question she asked her uncle and answers, does she learn not the most?
Okay, good. So she asks her uncle, right, a bunch of questions. Right, exactly. What do you think did anyone try to think of what the answers to that question was? Or those questions were?
This is a really big stretch, but I wonder if it has something to do with not knowing
mother. Does it have something to do with not knowing her mother? Kind of. It's related, but it's not explicitly tied. Well, I'll say that, right? So yes, I'll say more or less related. Okay. What else? Yeah, go ahead.
I feel like she's gonna find her mother, but it's not gonna be what she wanted to find.
Okay, good. So we'll add here found under different circumstances.
Yeah, that she would be left to like.
Yeah. So far, these two are the closest, right, to what happens. Aunt Emily, she does change, not in the way that Billy you're thinking of, right, but that does come into play, right? Her change and her moving away from having to behold herself to her family. It's just not necessarily in the sense of work. Okay. Based off of other elements in the text, like for example, its time, when the family arrived, all of that, right? What can we perhaps assume, even if it's not stated explicitly, right? What's the background for what Lee brought up as to why they're here? What might be the background?
A war.
Right, good.
We're gonna go into like the start of the war and I'm assuming what the opposite part of the war was.
Good. Okay. So they would have arrived before the actual war, right? They arrived in Canada before the war. So push that further. Some unwanted truths. Good. What kind of things related to Japanese Canadians during the war in Canada might they be hiding?
In my head, I'm calling them concentration camps, but I don't remember what they were actually called them. But the Japanese themselves almost were given their own little reserves at the time because people thought they were turning out Canada.
The term concentration camp was used at the time. You can call it whatever you want, because now we imagine concentration camps as specifically associated with what happened in Germany and in Eastern Europe, of course. But the time was a rather prevalent one. At the time, the term was rather prevalent for basically what we would call today work camps. Right?
Because they were forced to farm and fish, right?
Depends on the camp and where they were, right? But the long and the short of it is thousands of Japanese people on the coast after Pearl Harbor were moved more inland, right, towards these kinds of camps where they were kept under surveillance, right, because the Japanese were the big enemy after Nazi Germany. Okay. Good. So that's why I was saying that the mother's part here is related tangentially, but her revelation as to where she is and what happened to her is related to the war rather than the concentration camps themselves or the detention camps. Right? Yeah.
Can I make a theory?
Sure.
I feel like her mom was dead.
You'll have to read the novel to find out. Yeah. At the point when the novel is narrated, yes, but she's not dead from the start type of thing, right? Like she did live a life for a bit, and things happened to her that stop her from coming back to Canada, right? Things like the war situation in Japan, right? So that's why I say it's yeah. Go ahead.
They played around too with citizenship at that time, did they not? Like you had to. It was either you Japanese. There was something there about.
Okay, good. So now we're getting into like the themes, I guess, of the book, and we'll come back to this. It's not useless at all, but it is quite good on all of you, right? That you were thinking, even if I asked some questions, of course, but that you were thinking of where this novel was heading, right? What is being set up and why it's being set up in the way that it is. Right? Good. Sorry, I don't usually keep my hands in my pockets like this, but I'm genuinely cold in the classroom today. So to come back to your idea of citizenship, citizenship was, of course, a major issue in Canadian society, arguably since it started, right? Whenever you want that to be the case, right? Some people say it was in 1867 when we confederated into what we now know as Canada, ish. Others, will claim a little bit before, a little bit after. The timeline here doesn't really matter. What matters is that, by definition of having a nation state, right, whether it's Canada, France, Australia, Lebanon, whatever, right, you're immediately setting up the question of who is part of this nation and who is not. Right? How you actually approach that question can be productive or unproductive, as in positive and negative, of course. It can lead, for example, to distinctions in culture, right, that somewhat flourish and allow people to say, okay, well, we are slightly different, and that's beautiful, right? Whereas it can also lead to acts of exclusion, for example. To take a really simple, concrete example, in Canada, we've often used our cultural differences from the United States, right, minimal or arguable as they may be, right, in order to valorize ourselves as a nation state. Right? And some people, I think especially these days, might argue that that's a positive, right, thing, or at least a less harmful thing. Right? Because, hey, it means that Canada is a separate entity, right, that doesn't need to listen to what the United States says culturally, politically, and etc. In the context of all kinds of other populations, and that has changed drastically over time, right? I've given this example throughout the class, but it can be visible minorities or what today we would consider just white people, for example, the Irish, or Eastern Europeans, or all kinds of other populations, at some point were considered, quote unquote, not quite Canadian. Okay? I was going to say whatever our feelings about that. I don't think anyone here would think that that's necessarily a good thing, just based off of the discussions that I've been having with you all. But to come back to your question, Lee, to say that this is a question in Canadian society at this time would be to kind of minimize, right? It's always been some kind of question. Okay? It changes somewhat in the 1960s, where Canada, if we're not the first, then we're one of the first countries to institute a point system, right, for immigration. When I say point system, it is an attempt by the government to basically mechanize the way in which we accept immigrants, right, whether they're temporary or not, right? And it shouldn't be based on things like race or gender or class, right, but on things like what kind of job do you do, right? Or, are you here as a refugee, or things like that, right? Where it becomes literally a point system. And it's meant to create a distance that is less politically or racially motivated. Right? Has that always succeeded? No, but it is considered generally in the history of political thought to be some kind of step in the right direction. Right? It's better than the arbitrary no that we often gave to plenty of peoples, right, throughout time. Now, why am I talking about this? The history of Japanese Canadians is, I think, a really interesting case study when it comes to questions of citizenship, and when it comes to how that citizenship is narrated. Does anyone know when the first waves of Japanese citizens arrived here? Or immigrants? Yeah. Even earlier than that, right? Not too much earlier, but even earlier than that. So it's estimated that the first waves would have come in the 1850s, 1860s, right? So middle of the 19th century, right around the time when Canada, as a nation state with its own specific borders, was actually coming into existence, right? So there's an argument to be made that people like the Japanese, right, have been here since the beginning, right, in some way, shape, or form. So to then have there be this whole discussion as to whether or not they are considered official citizens, right, of Canada or whatever province they're in at that point, is rather demonstrative of this unease that the Canadian state has had with non-white populations and immigrants since its inception. Right? We use the examples of Indigenous and Black writers or populations in earlier classes, but this extends, of course, to others as well. We didn't talk about it explicitly with Fred Waugh, right? But he's a writer that talks a lot about that from the Chinese-Canadian perspective, right? Even if it's not something that we addressed in his poetry specifically. Are we all good so far on this?
I should
Yeah,
say,
please.
like the immigration before, I feel like, was it as impact as the immigration now? Like,
What do you say?
Would it have been as like noticeable?
Yes.
A little bit.
Yeah, for sure. It wasn't as big as people expected it to be. Famously, around this time as this picture was taken, so early 20th century. Our prime minister at the time, Wilfrid Laurier, was saying that the 20th century was going to be Canada's century because they were expecting so many immigrants to arrive, right? And that it would cause an explosion in population, in industry, and all kinds of things. That didn't quite pan out the way that it did. He was expecting there to be 100 million people in Canada by the end of the 20th century. As people in the 21st century, we know that to be patently wrong at this point. People are just more fearful of the cold, I guess, than they are to go to the United States. So it was still at the forefront of people's minds, and there was still noticeable enough immigration that there were things like immigration departments already at the time that had to manage, or felt like they had to manage, where people would best be settled. Right. If you want a really good sense of this, you can look at the history of the railway, right? The famous CPR, right, that was built across the country. So the management of the immigrants who came in, right, the laborers who came in order to build that railway, is a rather revelatory case study as to like how we actually managed it. A lot of those immigrants. You see a lot of similar rhetoric to what you see now, where the people in power were often saying, well, we can't keep them here because there's too many, quote unquote, and it will completely ruin whatever society we're building right now. Would that have actually happened in the 19th century? Probably not, in the same way that it's not actually ruining much today, right? But that kind of discourse was certainly around. Yeah. I don't know. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. It's just like when I think about like in middle years or like school, like stuff like that. Like there was definitely people that were immigrants when I went to school, but like now when I'm working in like the school division, it is completely different, and it's just like I guess that's more noticeable for me. I wouldn't have even thought of immigration before.
Yeah.
But it still was there. But it's just.
Yeah, I think also one of the major changes between then and now, whenever you want to kind of make that distinction, is that Canada has urbanized massively, and so inevitably we're more in contact with other peoples around us in ways that prior in human history we have never been before, no matter where you are in the world. Whereas, let's say before the Second World War, the majority of the world was still in rural locations where you could spend your entire lifetime without actually seeing your neighbors, right, or people around you. And so while these immigrants did arrive, what you started to notice was that they would often stay in rather localized pockets, right? You still see that actually hints of that if you look around Manitoba, for example. Right? Historically, there are places that are more Ukrainian, right? Or more Russian, or more Chinese, right? Part of that is because of exactly this phenomenon where for the longest time people just stayed in their local area with people that they would have known. And so you weren't necessarily as attentive to those realities.
Why do you think there's? I think so many.
That's a question for a political scientist. I mean, the short answer is you can have a mix of factors, right? Like climate catastrophe, which we've talked about obviously many times in this class, but people move because of that. War, right, actually forces people into new territories. That, combined with the fact that it actually is easier, right, on a physical level with the advent of planes, boats, technologies, all kinds of stuff to actually move in cases of crisis or opportunity, makes it so that people around the world are able to move much faster than ever before. If we had these technologies that we do in the 1900s or the 1800s, you can be sure that you would have, I'm convinced that you would have the same level of immigration as you do today, right? Because there were still already those elements that force people away, right? Or that ask that people come away. It doesn't all have to be negative. Sometimes people just leave because they want to also, right? But I think that certainly contributes to the increase. Wasn't expecting to go down that rabbit hole. Maybe I shot myself in the foot on that one, but
I think why would people want to come here if it's really cool?
I ask myself that question every day. Apparently, my grandparents, when they came over from Egypt, the options were Quebec or Brazil. And the only reason they chose Quebec is because my grandfather really liked the cold, right? He liked the idea of the cold, when everyone else in his family did not. But, the world being what it was at the time, that you listen to the patriarch. Big irony, and I can make a joke about it now because it's 60 years past. He died 6 months after coming to Quebec, so he never actually got to enjoy the cold that he wanted to benefit from. So, irony of ironies. It's sad, of course. It's the irony is what makes me laugh more than obviously like the person dying. But yeah, the reason why I'm also bringing up very briefly the history of Japanese Canadians is that while they have been on the Canadian territory for, or at least in any kind of significant way, for the almost 200 years at this point, it is rather fascinating to note that a lot of the narratives, both historical and literary, about Japanese Canadians do revolve around the internment camps. Right? Even though in that 200-year history, the internment camps lasted 4. Right? And on a purely numbers level, involved thousands of people rather than millions, for example, like other internment camps. And I'm not saying, again, that we should diminish, right, what happened to the Japanese in this case. It's an awful thing. It is just a fascinating phenomenon, right, that this particular event, which in the grand scheme of things was very short-lived, had such an impact for literal generations of people. Okay? I have a few clips to show today, both from Kogawa and other places. But right, Joy Kogawa was very young when these internment camps happened, right? And yet it's something that would have been passed down, right, in some kind of cultural memory, or I guess what we call today some kind of generational trauma, in a big bad way. And it might be interesting to consider why that is, right? Why such a historically short event had such a wide-reaching impact that has lasted for many, many times more than the actual event, right? Many, many years more than the actual event, I should say. If she was writing this novel in the late 80s and we're still talking about it in the 2020s, right? That's 10 times as long as the actual event would have happened. And that's really interesting.
Imagine they're still reminded constantly by racism.
Well, Joy Kogawa will bring up that exact point in one of the questions that I have a recording of. Right, she was interviewed on the CBC a few years ago, almost 30 years ago at this point, and she brings up exactly that point. Right? All right, I wanted to play this clip from CBC. This is from 1988. Let's see if I can
When
do it.
you are at isettlement.ca and the time comes to fill out your claim form.
While the ad plays. So this was in 1988. This is a news clip that passed on the CBC television at the time. Oops. I thought there was a second ad that was going to play. And I want you to pay attention not just to what they're talking about, right, but how they're actually talking about this event, which relates, of course, to our topic for today. And yeah, so pay attention to the discourse that's happening.
Good evening. Japanese Canadians will remember this as the day when Canada finally moved to right a wrong committed against them 4 decades ago. It was during the Second World War. Thousands of people were forced into internment camps simply because they were of Japanese descent. They've been waiting ever since for official acknowledgement of the injustice, and today they got it. An apology from the Prime Minister and compensation for their losses. Former internees call it a settlement that heals. Wendy Mesley begins our coverage in Ottawa.
I speak to members of our side in offering the Japanese Canadians a formal and sincere apology.
It was the apology Japanese Canadians had waited more than 40 years to hear. In the gallery, they stood and cheered. NDP leader Ed Rodman, whose first wife's family had been interned, was overcome by emotion as he read from a novel about life in the camps.
I cannot bear the memory. There are some nightmares from which there is no way.
This was the nightmare. In 1942, several months after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, 22,000 Japanese Canadians were sent to camps in northern British Columbia. Their homes and their livelihoods were taken away. Their families were torn apart. Not one was ever charged with an act of disloyalty. Brian Mulroney promised justice in the 1984 election campaign, but for 4 years, all his government offered was an apology and a fund for the Japanese community, no one for individuals. Then last month, the White House offered Japanese Americans, in turn there, compensation. Today, the Canadian government did the same.
Offered symbolic redress payment of $21,000.
All the survivors of the camps, about 13,000, will be eligible for $21,000 each. Those convicted for refusing to go to the camps will have their names cleared. $12 million will go to a Japanese community fund. Another $24 million will go to create a Canadian Race Relations Foundation to make sure this kind of discrimination never happens again. The project will cost almost $300 million, and it came just in time for the election call expected this fall.
If it happens today, I don't feel any guilt of whether we're Canadians because it's something that we struggle for.
It was an emotional day for everyone involved, for the Japanese Canadians and for the politicians.
Today is a historic landmark, not only for our community, but for the whole human rights issue of the country.
Wendy Mesley, CBC News, Ottawa.
The internment camps had commenced 40 years ago, but Masumi Takashiro said she has never been able to forget. She and her husband lost everything they had, a business, property, all the family's heirlooms. Her husband is one of the 9,000 internees who died before they could see today, but she knows he would be happy.
I'm feeling that you never could forget. It left a document on the table every day, and then how much he lost.
Japanese Canadians across the country reacted the same way. Francisco Miki in Winnipeg, watching her two sons, Art and Roy, negotiate this deal with the federal government is the best way the nightmare could end.
I'm so happy that my children were fighting for it.
Most of the Japanese Canadian internees still live in British Columbia. They came back to this area after they were freed from the camps and started over. This, they say, is what they wanted from the government. The money recognizes that each of them had something stolen. The apology means they can be proud of their past.
We're as okay as about speaking to the media or speaking to anybody about ourselves as Japanese ancestry. We're ashamed of it. We tried to hide from it. And now I think we're proud of it.
Charles Cadota is one of the early fighters for redress. He always knew he wasn't the enemy.
We're looking at a democracy. The redress issue was not an issue of money, it was an issue of justice, of human rights, of citizenship.
No one here pretends that $21,000 each will make up for the millions that were lost, or that an apology will make up for up to 7 hard years in the Kootenays. What they will do, the attorneys say, is prove to everybody that Japanese Canadians were good Canadians all along. Karen Webb, CBC News, Vancouver.
It's wild that they didn't clear their names until then. So they had a criminal record that whole time for nothing.
Yep.
Wow.
They absolutely did. What else did we notice about the way that they were talking about this? Actually, while you collect your thoughts, 10 points for whoever guesses which novel Ed Broadbent was reading from. Yes. Which, by the way, it goes to show just how impactful the novel was, since it came out like the year that, if I'm not mistaken, it came out in 88. So, right, within a few years, at least, of when Broadbent was reading it in the House of Commons. Right? I'm just going to fact check myself, just to make sure that I'm not saying something silly. 1981. Okay, I was not that far off. Sorry, I thought it was later than that. But still, right, just goes to show just how quickly it had an impact. Right? Yeah, because this is an English class, right? Let's talk about the way that they discuss it, especially in that first half. I think it's particularly insightful in the way that, the political and social discourse around this question of redress was being discussed in the video. Did we notice anything in particular?
We didn't do it until the Americans did it.
That is absolutely true,
And
right?
an election year, too.
And an election year, right? For those of you who were not alive at that point, Brian Mulroney was prime minister at the time, and he was about to face one of the greatest defeats in, honestly, Canadian political history, right? He was careening towards disaster. Well, it depends on who you ask. If you ask my dad, he was the best prime minister who ever lived. If you ask me, he should burn in hell. We don't have time to get into that today. But I don't particularly think he was a good prime minister, but we can maybe discuss that tomorrow. I think it fits better with Dion Brand's poetry. Anyway, so yeah, absolutely. It was very interesting that it was an electoral promise back in the mid-'80s, which is already surprisingly late, considering that it had happened 40 years prior, right? And then it only came, like Mel, you were saying, after the Americans did, which is par for the course for the Mulroney government, aping off of what the Americans were doing. And subsequently doing it right as an election campaign was gearing up, which adds a level of cynicism to it that I don't know. I'm not quite sure if the CBC is into or not, right? Like, I can't really get a pulse on the actual presenter. She seems to be presenting it in a very neutral way, right?
But the fact that she said it at all.
Mm-hmm. The fact that she said it at all bears considering, and probably says more about her intentions than anything else. You'll remember. I'm sorry. Yes, he would stay in. He would stay in power for another bit, but his popularity would kind of dwindle, but not because of this. More with an overall dissatisfaction with the Conservative Party at the time. And he would not finish his term, and he would be replaced by our only prime minister, who is a woman, Kim Campbell. Right, that's when she comes in. She gets absolutely destroyed at the next elections, and the Liberals take over for a bit. You'll remember also, I think this was our first or second class. I think it was our first, when we were talking about declarations and acknowledgements. Do you remember what we said about those? Right, like the territorial acknowledgements, that we often see at the start of the bills. Right. Some people consider them rather shallow. Right? Not unimportant, right? It is, again, a step in the right direction, but lacking a bit of gumption, to put it in more common parlance. Personally, when I hear something like this, I do get a similar sense from it. And the presenter at the end kind of goes mask off with it when she says that nobody's pretending like this will actually do anything. It's just ceremonial more than anything else, which kind of rubs me the wrong way at the end of the day. And at the very least, encourages a continued response from an artistic and a literary sense, if not in a political sense. So you'll have noticed also that in the video, they interview a Mrs. Mickey, right? And she's saying how her sons, Art and Roy, were part of the activists who campaigned for this kind of redress. Right? This is the Roy that she's talking about, right? Roy Mickey, who was a poet and, as you saw from this video, an activist as well. And a literary critic in his own right. He was a very well-respected member of the literary community in Canada. And the reason why I wanted to stop by a detour from him is that I think he hits at something in his poem that not only gives a good preface to Obasan as a text, but also allows us to think about the question that I asked earlier, which is, why do we still talk about this in such an expansive way when it happened for such a short period of time? Right? And I think his poem starts to hint at that in a really interesting way. Does anyone want to read part of it?
I'll do it. For Auntie Nagasaki, it's the same story, told again and again. The modulations and the machinations, the maudlin and the dream. Schemes and data, a million documents, a single story.
Sorry, you're right here.
And a single story, Comes. She said she moved into her house, her dream house, on December 6th. Fell into a deep sleep, stirred the dream. To wake, to war, and the splitting apart, her son, sent off to Petawawa, barbed wire. Her husband, to Tete Jean. Herself to Greenwood. Greenwood. Ghost town. New names, her memory, and the train. Later to Montreal. The commission said there'd be jobs there. 5 days, 4 nights. Sitting and sleeping in the coach. Dreaming of the coast. The French tongue, the English tongue, Words and words. Oh, Canada.
So it's only halfway through the poem that we get a reference to war, right? Actually, a little bit past halfway through. The reason why I think this is so insightful is really for that first part here. For Auntie Nagasaki, it's the same story told again and again before going into a poetry about a poem about displacement, war, and so on. Right, the machinations of others. And one of the reasons why I think we focus on the Japanese internment camps historically and culturally speaking is in many ways, I think it's the culmination of what had been up to that point a history of treatment of Asian Canadians and Japanese Canadians more specifically. Okay? We'll come to Obasan in a second, of course, but we can think when he references the displacement, right, we can think of the displacement of people from Japan to Canada, who were then kicked back from Canada to Japan, right, in the 19th century. So there's that kind of displacement. In the early 20th century, there was a whole wave of anti-Asian sentiment in British Columbia to the point where there are entire political parties who were formed specifically around that single quote-unquote issue. Right? If ever you've heard the term yellow panic, that's what that refers to. Okay? It's an obviously racist connoted term, but that's where it comes from, is that so-called moral panic or political panic or social panic that saw Asian people as replacing quote-unquote proper British Columbians, right? And so even though his focus with references to Nagasaki and to the war and then the displacement into Petawawa and Montreal and so on is clearly centered around the internment camps in World War II, the references to this being something that has happened throughout Japanese Canadian history is revelatory, I think, in this case. Was there anything else that I wanted to say about this? Yeah. And of course, it ends on a rather bitter note, I guess would be a way of putting it. And this is something that, to the CBC's credit, they get at in the little newsreel that they put together, is that a lot of these internees had never been charged with anything. They were just living their lives. A lot of them had been on the territory for generations at that point. By the 1940s, we were already on the second or third generation of Japanese Canadians. Right? And so the dreams, right, not only of the coast, their original place, but also most of them already spoke English and French, right? The official languages of Canada at this point. It wasn't technically the official language, but by the 1940s, but for all intents and purposes, it was. So yeah, anything I just wanted to use this as an example, but anything we wanted to add about Kome's story? Read Roy Mickey. He's great. There's an edition of his complete poems in the library across the hall.
You get money for all those roles.
No. I should at this point, but yeah, exactly. I will take any opportunity I can to promote any library in the world because I think they're the greatest thing since sliced bread. And if only they had money to actually give referrals. Okay. I got to the Joy Kogawa slide, but I just want to make sure in my notes that I'm not forgetting anything. No, okay. So the text is short enough, I think, that we can almost go like bit by bit through it. But these are, of course, if you want to take pictures, go ahead. I don't care. These are some of the elements that I think are worth parsing out in no particular order, as evidenced by the fact that I put speech and silence fifth, even though it's
The epigraph.
yeah, even though it's in the epigraph. But yeah, I just thought these were some of the ideas that we could launch into. Let me go. Whoops. Let me go to the actual text.
I thought this part was really interesting that it just says the Bible instead of which part of the Bible it's from.
Doesn't mention, yeah. I promised myself that I would actually look it up to see what part of the Bible, but
Revelation. I looked.
it's Revelation.
Yeah.
Pop quiz. What does Revelations talk about in the Bible?
It's also about Earth and like how it's going to be in the next few years.
Yeah, basically at the
How
time.
Jesus is going to come back for the second time now. We're going to have the second ascension.
Yeah. It's basically the second coming and also the apocalypse. It's basically what happens in Revelations.
And it's kind of playing out on that line.
I'm sorry.
I said it's starting to look true.
It's starting to look true. I don't think so. I'm not a particularly religious person, as I've mentioned before, but I think that's one of the reasons why people are turning more and more towards religion is exactly what you're talking about, right? Is because of this apocalyptic world that some people feel that we live in.
It's funny though, because people have been saying that since it was written.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's like the end times now. Oh, it's like the end times now. Something bad's happening. It's like the end times now.
Every year is the end times since
The last 2,000 years.
20 billion BC or whatever. Yeah. Which I guess is part of the we can get into the whole endurance of religious texts like that, but yeah, it is rather demonstrative. So I guess there would be two questions from that. First, why not mention that it's from Revelations? And if it is from Revelations, well, since it is from Revelations, I should say, what does that tell us about the quote and what Obasan is trying to do as a literary text?
That they overcame something incredibly difficult.
Right. On the most basic level, yeah. On the most basic level, it is exactly that. Blessed, to paraphrase, blessed are the people who overcome trials and tribulations. Right? You'll get the kingdom of heaven. Person who kind of like overcomes whatever adversity comes your way. Yeah, I didn't actually think for a second to the first time I read this, which was during my undergrad, to look up what part of the Bible it was. And part of me thinks that it almost doesn't matter, but the more I think about it, the more I think the occlusion, of the section that it's from is rather indicative. Hiding the end times, right? Which basically centers the entire thing. Since if you can overcome a literal apocalypse, what else can you overcome? Right? And the apocalypse in this text takes on two meanings, right? both generational with the detention and concentration camps, but also the background that's happening at the same time. What other kind of apocalyptic event happens in World War II that would directly affect the Japanese?
Hiroshima.
And
Sorry.
right, the bomb, right? The capital B bomb, right? Is our erstwhile history teacher mentioned this on his timeline this week?
Look like
No. Weird thing to omit from a timeline of history that also includes Wilson and
everything
the
about World War
Holocaust.
II.
I'm sorry?
You can't write everything about World War II.
That's true, you can't. Yeah, but I feel like it's an important step between World War II and the Cold War, right, is the creation of the bomb. Here I am just dunking on this teacher I've never met in my life.
Maybe they said it out loud.
Yeah, probably. Anyway, right. So if you're a reader who would look this up, right, or who maybe at the time knows, right, about their biblical literature.
Jeez, can you imagine? Oh, I know exactly where those 10 words are from.
Look, I've met people like that who know literature by heart. It is so impressive, whether it's this or any other type of literature. If you want like to impress someone on a date or like a family or whatever, learn a poem by heart. It kills every time, right? I'm not even joking. It's awesome. I once hesitated to do that as an evaluation. Instead of having students do an exam, if they wanted to recite a poem by heart, they could do that as a replacement, and I never actually followed through on it. But it is an impressive feat to do.
Can we do that?
Do you think you can actually recite a poem in the next week?
Yes.
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 No.
I think this is interesting
Yeah.
to be included because, like, to them it was the apocalypse, but to us it's just the Bible.
Yeah. Absolutely. How many people in Canada or North America more broadly actively thought about the bomb as it was happening? Right? Some, but just by the fact of media, right, being what it was at the time, the actual news of it would have been a little bit later, or just through the propaganda of the war machine, right, being what it was, entering into the Cold War. It wouldn't have necessarily crossed a lot of people's minds, right? Certainly it was in the discourse, right? People were either saying that it was really an advancement in warfare or was going to bring about the end times. But I think the average person, when it first happened, wouldn't have necessarily thought twice about it. In fact, it was kept rather under wraps, right? So as entire cities were decimated, your average person in Canada was just living their life, right? Or no, technically they were on the front, but you know. Okay. I also like the part here, and we'll give him a white stone, and in the stone a new name written. I don't actually know what the rest of it is. A new name written if they mention the name. But to me, it signifies again this idea of being inscribed into eternity. Right? We have this sense of stones as being this eternal, forever material, and again, getting at how we tell stories and what actually manifests through time. Okay. Just because it's so important to the entire novel, someone other than Mel, since you read the poem, can someone read this section out loud? We're not going to read every single piece, but I just want to read the important parts out loud for everyone. Go ahead.
There is a silence that cannot speak. There is a silence that will not speak. Beneath the grass, the speaking dreams like a princess, sunset sleep. The speech that breathes comes forth from the amniotic deep. To attend its voice, I can hear it say, is to embrace its absence. But I fail the task, the word is stone. I admit it. I hate the stillness, I hate the stone, I hate the sealed vault with its cold icon. I hate the staring into the night, the questions thinning into space, the sky swallowing the echoes. Unless the stone burst with telling, unless the seed flowers with speech, there is in my life no living word. The sound I hear is only sound, white sound. Words, when they fall, are fall marks on the earth. They are hailstones seeking an underground stream. If I could follow the stream down and down to the hidden voice, would I come at last to the free word? I ask the night skies if the silence is steadfast. There is no reply.
Good. Thank you. We stopped clapping after a certain point for recitals. So, of course, there are two things here that carry through in this section, not three, that carry through in the section that I had you read. The first is silence, which we brought up with the uncle and his refusal to speak. But, of course, if you're an attentive reader, which you all are, you notice that there are other characters and situations that reflect this silence in the beginning of the narrative. And, of course, we get the element of... Actually, I said two or three. So there's silence. We get the element of the environment, different kind of environment than we've been talking about. Not extractive as was seen in the Marrow Thieves, but more metaphorical and longing as an environment. And I would argue that the third major one is the stillness. I hate the stillness, I hate stone, I hate the sealed vault with its cold icon. Let's see. I'll add stillness here, just so we can have it written down. It is a bit of a contradiction, right? Having your name or having a name written on stone in the first epigraph, and then immediately go into the text proper, into this kind of preface that's not called a preface, and have the narrator say, "I hate stone." And what immediately comes to mind is, I hate stone that indicates a history that I have no control over, right? Or that I was not a part of, or that was imposed onto me. And I think that reading only makes sense once you've read the actual novel. I mean, at this point, you don't necessarily know that from the text.
I took it as like in the first epigraph, because she was quite young at that point in the internment camp. So the adults who experienced it, they endured it, and then what they got from it was this like stoicism, inability to speak about it, this stoniness.
Yeah.
And that's what she hates.
Yeah. That makes sense. I would agree with that. I don't have much to add on that, but I agree. Yeah. And I think I don't know if I've mentioned this in class before, but it's related to the war. You do have this tendency. The more I'm saying it, the more I feel like I've said this before. So please stop me if I have. I feel like there is a tendency in people who did experience war events to either be very, very discussive of it or very silent of it. My grandfather was one of those people who, the other grandfather, the one who lived for a while. He was someone who never spoke about the war. He would have been in his early 20s when he went to Europe. Right? Never spoke about it again. His brother, on the other hand, was at D-Day and couldn't shut up about it. And I'm not blaming either or. Like, I understand the mechanisms psychologically why that would happen in one way or another, right? But I feel like that's an example, just to give a different one, where you get this sense of a silence that can't speak or will not speak. People refusing to actually unpack that wound, whatever that wound may be for them. Anything else that we wanted to highlight in this before I moved on?
The part, words when they fall are pockmarks on the earth. Is that referring to, like lashing out? Like the adults, they bottle it all up, but then they lash out angrily. Do you think?
I don't remember that being that much of a thing in the novel itself, right? Of someone exploding in that particular way, right? But at the very least, to add on to what you're saying, I think the bottling up of those words, whenever they come out, whether it is in anger or just a pressure valve releasing, right? I do think you're correct in saying that it has a profound impact on the world around you, on the literal sense. It's become a cliche at this point. You can think of the way that people say, both in real life and in literature, right? This person revealed something to me, and the earth, right, let out from under my feet, right? Or I could no longer feel the world around me, right? Something like that, in which the ground literally shifts, right? For which you understand something, for which you engage in the world. That will be the case with our narrator, Naomi. To an extent, Aunt Emily also goes through this, although for different reasons. And part of it is related to the history that she uncovers and what we talked about earlier with the mother and what happens to her. White sound is a really interesting, just before that, right? The words when they evoke white sound. I think clearly it's meant to evoke white noise, right? That kind of the sound of the universe or whatever. But it's not quite the same thing. There's a distortion of it. Yeah, go for it.
I was going to say, is it to indicate like words have no meaning that really have no sound? Like it's just a word.
Right. Okay, that's an interesting way of thinking of it. I was thinking of a noise that's so loud that it feels like it's a piercing whiteness, right?
I was thinking more like the speaker in Charlie Brown.
But I'm not against that either, and I think that would hold true to the narrative as well. Yeah. It's the same reason why some poetry that we've talked about in class, right, leaves those blank spaces as well sometimes, where you don't need to put words or you can't put words for a specific situation, so all you leave is a gap that cannot speak, right, to use the terms of the text. I don't mind doing it because at this point I'm like 10 weeks in, but having 3 screens open and juggling at all times during the class is getting to be somewhat of a head trip. Okay. So I know it's almost 7:30, and that means it's almost time to stretch our legs. Who can tell me what happens in chapter 1? Like 2-sentence summary. What's chapter 1 about? It's 2.5 pages, but technically a lot happens on a thematic level, or even on a metaphorical level. What is the pure action / event that happens in that chapter. Yeah.
This is gonna be really bad, but essentially we just get the like a little bit of backstory between Naomi and her uncle, and we see like the first little trip they make, and we get a little insight to the aunt, and then kind of understand like the relationship she has with her.
Good. Right. So, as novels do, right? Background. Right. The first chapters are usually meant to set up also the main action or the main goal or purpose. Arguably, that was set up in the preface, right? In misunderstanding what silence is or how to actually engage with a silence. So the preface is doing a lot of heavy lifting in this particular case. But you do get a return to that preface in a few ways, as we're also getting what Lee was saying, a bit of background on their relationship, on Naomi and her uncle's relationship. How would we describe that relationship based off of this chapter? What kind of relationship does it seem to be? Father-daughter, which when you first read it, you're maybe less clear on because you don't know that, her parents are not present. Yeah.
Maybe not father-daughter, maybe more grandfather-daughter.
Okay. I guess this is opening a can of worms, but how do you distinguish the two in this particular instance?
Well, it's the joking around between the two of them.
Okay.
And so when he says
that says more about your relationship with your dad that you can't joke around with him.
It's because with my grandma it's more like we get more teasy and less formal, but with my dad, I can still joke around with him, but he's still always gonna always talking about life lessons and
right.
there was a bit less.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, this just seems like more of a special moment than an everyday moment.
Okay. Interesting. It seems like a special moment, but at the same time, isn't it later in the text that they say that they've been doing this since 1956?
No, I think it is still at the big, but it's like a shared moment for whenever they get together.
Right. Okay. I see what you mean. Okay. So yeah, not against that. The grandfather.
Paternal, I guess.
Yeah.
They seem very close, but also strained.
Why would they be strained, one might ask? I'm sorry?
Why they're there.
Right. Okay, so the weight of history certainly, I think, bears a certain brunt of that. We can come back to that in relation to how she describes her grandfather in perhaps problematic fashion. I don't know. We'll come to that discussion. It's a bit unexpected as far as cultural norms are concerned. And again, I'm not an expert in Japanese culture, especially not as it was happening in the 70s. But from what I've read or been told by members of Japanese Canadian communities, right, it does seem to be at times or most often a more gender-specific culture, right, or community, in which it would make typically more sense to have mother-daughter or mother-grandmother daughter-grandmother relationships, right, rather than daughter-uncle, or to pick up on your metaphor, Lee, right, daughter-grandfather relationships. Which comes back to what you were saying, Ubube, about some kind of strain, at least socially or familially. But again, I don't want to unpack that too much just because I'm less familiar with the minutia of that. I'm kind of doing secondhand information at this point. Sorry, I thought I heard someone.
No, I was agreeing.
Yeah, okay. For a second, I thought I was hearing voices.
It's a ghost.
Yeah, it's the ghosts of the classroom. They're back. Yeah, please.
Sorry, I'm rethinking what I read. Is there no mention of her father?
I'm sorry?
Her father?
Yeah, what about him?
Did I miss that? I'm blanking on if he's alive or not. I can't remember.
Who can answer that question?
He's
He's mentioned.
Is he dead?
So the father he's not dead. He leaves Naomi in Obasan's care, right? So their relationship is not perfect. We'll put it that way.
Does it, I like,
Mhm.
I can't believe I don't remember this. Does it, so was it specified if he abandoned her or if he's like looking for his wife or grieving his wife? Like,
Right. No.
does it say it in the rest of the book? Because if so, I'm.
It's made more explicit in the rest of the book, but I can tell you, right? He's sent to an internment camp, and that's why Naomi is left in the care of.
Does she understand that at that age?
When she's younger, no. Later, she comes to understand it. Oh shoot! What happens to him?
Sorry.
I actually don't remember what happens to. Oh my god!
Just Google it.
I could Google it, but oh crap! Anyway, I'll Google it during the break and answer you more specifically, just so you don't have to look at me Google, which is totally fascinating. I'm sure. But yeah, I can't remember off the top of my head what happens to him specifically. We'll finish this chapter and then take a break. But three of the major themes, right, emerge in this chapter. The one we've already talked about with the silence. Okay, so we're not necessarily going to retread that. We get the sense starting here of another one of those themes. I inch my way down the steep path and along the stretch where the side of the slope oozes wet from the surface seepage of the underground stream. Wild rose bushes, there's a tongue twister, prickly and profuse with green, cluster along the edges of the trickle. I can smell them as I descend. At the bottom of the coulee, I can hear the gurgling of the slowly moving water. I stand for a long time, watching as the contours of the coulee erode slowly in the night. So we obviously get a reference to water, right? The slowly moving water, right there, which hints us back to the stillness. I'm sorry. No, but the ocean comes a little bit later, though. But you're right. It sets up the ocean that will come later and refers back to the stillness from the preface, right? It contrasts that in that particular way.
Maybe this is reaching, but the way she talks about erosion too, and the fact that they're set in a coulee, which I googled it, and it's like a harsh valley carved out by a glacier.
Yeah.
So maybe that has to do with like eroded relationships.
Eroded relationships, certainly, right? Yeah, that's not where I was going with this because I was going to stick with the environment, but I like that, right? The idea of eroded relationships. Couler, for those of you who don't know, in French means to run, right? To like a trickle actually would be a couler, right? And that's where the term couler or coulis comes from. And so you get this explicit tying together of these things that we don't necessarily associate with flow, right? A rose bush, later a patch of grass, right? With trickling, obviously, but also like this erosion, this descent, and leading into the gurgling of the slowly moving water, right? And so these elements of stillness and movement are overlapping in perhaps contradictory, but imagistically interesting ways. I'm still thinking about your comment on erosion of relationships.
Because it talks later, I think, in a different chapter about how close their family was, all knit together, and how
Yeah.
the relationships didn't say that they were murdered, I don't think, but how they like fell apart kind of.
They weren't. Yeah, they fell apart in part because of circumstance, right? Less because of anything of their own will. Right? The dad didn't leave intentionally; he was inadvertently separated from his family. Right? It's not a spoiler since it happens in like chapter 2, but uncle dies. Right? So there is that separation. The mother goes back to Japan. Right? For reasons which you will read about if you read the novel. But you get this sense that even if there is these erosions, as you say, it's not because they hate each other. Right? Certainly not. If anything, the strains in their relationship come from the fact that they're trying to keep this situation together in spite of the erosions of everything around them. Right? Which I guess ties into the more environmental element as well, right? It's technically unified, but forces of a massive ocean or glaciers or whatever erode it and change it over time that you can't necessarily stop. Yes, you had your hand up.
Did she get deported?
When you say she, no, but there's a reason. She could have come back and she doesn't, for a very specific reason. It's not deportation. It's not because she's forced by the government or anything like that. But Naomi only finds that out at the end, so it doesn't necessarily contribute to the erosion part here. Oh shoot. Yeah, it was. Why do we come here every year? Shoot, yeah, the ocean part was before. I'm sorry.
So the closest, however, get to the ocean.
Yeah.
Maximum.
Yes, I'm looking for that part specifically. I had it highlighted in my copy here. The coulee is so still, yeah. Shoot. Too young, still too young. His mouth is open. Did I? No, I didn't imagine this. Oh, right. Okay, it's right at the start. Yeah. Yeah. This is the closest Uncle ever gets to the ocean. Right. Okay, it was right at the start. Why create this comparison with the ocean? It seems like an odd metaphor to make. Because famously, the prairies do not have oceans. Well, they at one point, but not anymore.
As they cross the ocean.
Sorry, you both spoke at the same time.
Because they cross the ocean.
Right. Is that what you're going to say?
No, I'm wrong.
No.
No.
I heard what you said.
He's a fisherman.
Yeah.
Okay, that's true. Good. So I think both are absolutely accurate, right? So he's a fisherman on one hand, right? Which is a very difficult profession to conduct on the prairies, right? Fishermen. I guess in lakes, but I don't know to what extent the fishing industry is booming on the prairies. I can't imagine it's the main source of anyone's income. So there is that, right, displacement from traditions. Are you laughing because I'm totally wrong? No, okay. So there's that displacement from his calling in that sense. But it's also, of course, you get this reference to what I was talking about earlier with the Roy Mickey poem, pointing to a history of displacement, right? Crossing over an ocean in order to get here, the deportations that would have happened within Uncle's lifetime of some of his fellow Japanese Canadians, or even of Naomi's mother, right, who would have gone back to Japan. And by during the 1940s, at the very least, boats were still the main mode of transportation for a lot of people. Like, common air travel was not really a thing yet. So I don't think it's that much of a stretch to indicate it in that sense. Do we want to talk about the Sitting Bull thing now or take a break?
Break, please.
Break, please. Go ahead, stretch your legs come back at 45, and then we'll talk about it. Fantastic. Okay, so the last little bit that I wanted to talk about in chapter 1, because it doesn't really come up anywhere else in the novel, right? It's really just a passing description of her uncle, and if anything, it's a choice. So the passage I'm referring to is second to third page. Everything in front of us is virgin land. Debatable, but okay. From the beginning of time, the grass along this stretch of prairie has not been cut. About a mile east is a spot which was once an Indian buffalo jump, a high steep cliff where the buffalo were stampeded and fell to their deaths. All the bones are still there, some sticking right out of the side of a fresh landslide. Uncle could be Chief Sitting Bull, squatting here. He has the same prairie-baked skin, the deep brown furrows like dry riverbeds creasing his cheeks. All he needs is a feather headdress, and he would be perfect for a picture postcard. Indian Chief from Canadian Prairie. Souvenir of Alberta, made in Japan. And then there's the transition to some of her classmates or children. What do we make of a passage like this? Almost 40 years later. Actually, a little over 40 years later, 45 years later. And by the way, if anyone didn't look it up, Chief Sitting. This is the kind of description that she was talking about. The Sitting Bull was a historical person, right? Actually existed. Seen here to tie it most explicitly with Billy the Kid, right? With other famous cowboy, Buffalo Bill, right? Different Bill. Thoughts? So I can go on about this for a few minutes, but I'm curious to let you speak about it for a second. There are two ways that we can maybe consider this. Either it's problematic, right? Like a bizarre comparison and appropriation, or it's thematic. Or maybe a bit of both, to be entirely honest, right? It can be both. We can take the ultimate postmodern stance and just say it's always both. Right?
It's always everything.
It's always everything at the same time, right? Yeah.
When was this written?
1981. Oh, indeed.
I was gonna say, like,
Yeah.
does it draw on, like, obviously the residential schools and then the colonization there, but we haven't even, like, in 1981, that was never recognized, so obviously that's not the actual connection.
The recognition is tenuous. Well, it would have been recognized by indigenous peoples, but they were still open, so it was just like a fact.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Because I was gonna say, like, maybe they feel like the same, like, it's easy to connect that way, but I don't know.
I know.
Well, like, they were, like, obviously, like, misplaced, like, reservations, and then the camps. They have the two, the Japanese and First Nations were that can relate in large ways.
Okay.
From, like, how they were treated by Canada.
Right. Importantly, it's not really an impersonation that's happening. She's not saying he actually impersonated Chief Sitting Bull, right? It wasn't his part-time job. There were people that did that in, like, shows and so on. actually around this, no, it wouldn't have been around this time, but around the time when the story takes place in the 30s and 40s, there was a rather famous example of this. A very tanned British man named Archibald Bellamy, you can look him up, went by the name for basically his entire life as Grey Owl. And yeah.
He has a cat and like.
Yeah. No, he was recognized at the time as like an indigenous activist and so on. And it's only at the end of his life, or even actually after he died, I'm not sure like how the timeline lines up for that, that people realized that he was just a British man putting on a show for his entire life, right? And we can unpack that whole like pretendian thing till the cows come home, but importantly, he's not one of those people, right? The narrator here is making that comparison as far as looks are concerned, which, you know, some people just look like other people, right? Sometimes that happens. But the comparison also goes beyond visuals on the location element that Lee was bringing up.
Did you say location or vocation?
Location. Okay. No, I wouldn't exactly call pretending to be an indigenous person a vocation, although it worked for Bellamy, apparently.
And Thomas King for a while.
Thomas King's a different thing, I think, but because I think because the thing with Thomas King is that I think he always was told that he was indigenous, and he should have taken the steps to look into it, but he never took the steps, and so he just assumed that it was correct, right? And I think that anyone who, because he's the one who broke the news about his own identity, right? It's not someone else who broke that news for him and outed him. He's the one who did the DNA test. So I think there is a level of genuineness to that, right? He genuinely thought about it, but yeah. I actually had a professor at Concordia who that happened to. She claimed to be Odawa, and right after I graduated, it came out that she was not, and basically her entire career was built on that foundation of indigenous health and so on and so forth, and nope.
Like
Local news, yeah. Right, local and academic news, so like 5 people learned about it, but yeah. But yeah, so anyway. So aside from the location element, of displacement and the reservations, actually I say location, but ties into the movement and stillness point that we were bringing up earlier.
Even if she didn't know about residential schools, she certainly would have known that indigenous people experience racism from white people.
Yeah.
Japanese people look similar and also experienced white racism from white people.
Yeah. So the history of racism certainly comes into play. Yeah, and usually the way that people talk about like the knowledge of residential schools and all of that, it's with hindsight we say that it's, you know, greater. We know more about it now, of course, because of the historical documents, so we have a breadth of knowledge about it. But to say that people didn't know about them would be factually inaccurate. People were aware of it. Unpack that more. What other connections is she making? She's making it even deeper than just a history of racism and the displacement part. Mm-hmm.
There's a spiritual connection, but that does come in more when she talks about the children in her classes, like see the animal like shyness she recognizes.
Right.
That could tie into like the spiritual or two-spirit.
Yeah, the two-spirit I'm not sure, just because that's a queerness thing, but
it is traditionally like indigenous culture.
Yeah.
It is like it's that you can have more than one spirit, and it is ways that you could, like, should you pass away, you could come back as an animal. And
Yeah.
then it was turned into a queer thing.
Okay, so great. So good to know. Thank you.
Sorry to correct you.
No, please. I will always be the first person to admit that I do not know everything. Please, by all means. I understand it in its modern sense of the queerness, but great, good to know that background. So the spiritual connection is interesting. We talked about it a little bit yesterday, right? How a lot of indigenous spiritual practices try to emphasize this kind of connection to animals, land, etc. And as we talked about before the break, it's explicitly mentioned in the text that Uncle and the ocean have this kind of connection, right? Whether it's a physical ocean that he sees or remembers, or the ocean that he crossed metaphorically, etc., and so forth. Yeah.
Oh, I guess this one also kind of ties into the spiritual or the connection with land. Like when in that first, like the hill surface as if responding to command from Uncle's ocean or Chan. Like it's also like the it's up a little bit. It talks about how so just the nature connection.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'm looking for it.
Right at the top.
Right at the top.
Wait. Up a little bit. Bring a cursor. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay. The hill surface as if responding to a command from Uncle's outstretched hand for it. Undulates suddenly in a breeze. Right? Rhythmical as if ocean waves. You can imagine, right? And we've all done this, or at least maybe not. I've done this, right? Where you kind of follow the wind, in a sense, and it's kind of cool. You like to imagine, like, haha, I can control the wind. I'm a magician. It's fantastic stuff. We can unpack that even more. From the very first line, there's something that carries over almost through the rest of that section.
The very first line of the chapter 1, or
The virgin land or the beginning of time? Time.
grass along the stretch of green nothing cut.
Time plays a really interesting role in, especially that verse section here, but arguably throughout the novel itself. Right? There's a reason why it starts with a specific mention of time. Right? In the modern world, we tend to dictate everything, right, by the hours of a clock. Right? We're very precise on these things. But as we mentioned with the poems by Liz Howard that we were talking about, where she gets at this sense of deep time, right? And the Tish poets also embrace this in many ways as well. There's a certain sense where when we talk about a duration, after a certain period, it becomes just a length of time that is no longer calculable in seconds, minutes, or even hours. Right? And to me, when I read a passage like this, and then I saw your hand up, when I read a passage like this, there's a connection being made between Japanese presence and indigenous presence. This is not Kogawa saying that, right, the indigenous people were not the first people on the land. I don't think that's fair to impose that reading onto her. But when we're talking, right, on a scale of hundreds of years, right, which was already true at this point, right, it had at least been 100 years that the Japanese people were there, I think she is pointing to a fact of, right, duration and length that could be interesting to unpack, right? We have both been here for quite a bit of time, right? Whether we wanted to or not, right? Which, on a certain level, does give us this connection to the Virgin Land that we were pointing to earlier. Again, it can get a little bit dicey just because a lot of that rhetoric has been used by different peoples throughout time, right, throughout recorded history at the very least, to justify, right, some pretty awful stuff. Right? But I don't get a sense of it being ill-intentioned here necessarily, at least from what I know of Kogawa and the rest of the text. Yeah, you had your hand up.
I was actually gonna comment, and then like as you said, like recorded history, that kind of like helps my comment is like I don't know if it's I believe it's sort of an indigenous phrase or like something to help support when talking about indigenous people being on the land. It's the phrasing time immemorial.
Right.
So like that kind of like that's kind of as we started speaking, that's kind of what popped into my head, like just the idea that like there's history before history is taught is recorded.
Yeah, exactly. And even the concept there's an increasing amount of academic work on this, but the concept of prehistory is a rather wonky value judgment when you think about it, right? Because it assumes that history begins with the people who were able to record it, right, and write it down, which is a skewering of basically thousands of years of history that was not written down, right, across the world again, right? Again, coming back to this idea of history being shaped and narrativized in some way. Okay, just looking at this real quick, I'm just making sure that I didn't forget anything.
Fun fact, there's a place in Alberta called Head Smashed in Buffalo Jump.
Yes, there is. Yes, there is. Yeah. Has anyone ever seen those buffalo sites? Yeah. It's pretty haunting, even if there's no bones necessarily. I think some of them still have the bones. Yeah, pretty haunting stuff to see. Although it does point to exactly what we're talking about here, right? This entwinement of a finite life, whether it's a buffalo or a Japanese or an indigenous person, and this blending into mudslides and these things that are thousands, if not millions of years old, into this actual site for observation, right? Like a postcard almost. Interesting to think about. Yeah, if you want to not sleep at night, you can look up those buffalo jumps. There's some incredible pictures that were taken in the 19th century of those situations, right? From a historical perspective, it's really interesting, but it's also very disturbing.
It's like a sensitive person probably cry.
I guess it depends how sensitive we're talking here, but like there are limitations of the camera technologies of the time, so there's like blurriness to it inevitably. But the implication of it is pretty impactful. Okay, so I just want to make sure. I think that's all I wanted to talk about with chapter 1. Yeah. So chapter 2 sets up something completely different, right? What happens in chapter 2?
She goes on a date. Her uncle dies. Or she remembers going on a date.
Right, she remembers going on a date. We start in a different setting in the classroom, right? Where, to come back to your point you said during the break of like still current racism, it's what we would call like everyday racism in modern parlance. I don't know if that existed already in the 80s as a term, but right, the kids kind of poking fun at her name and poking fun at the fact that she's still unmarried at this stage in her life, even though she's a spinstress. Spinster, sorry, not spinstress. Which, yeah, that one was funny. I remember my mom had been called a spinster for a bit, which is just to show how like not that far away in time those kinds of mores were. Granted, my mom is older than most, but still. Yeah, there was something else I wanted to bring up here. Yeah. I have to admit, even if it's in a funny situation, I did appreciate the pronunciation guide that she was that she was offering to her classmate to her school children. Sorry, just because my Japanese pronunciation is awful, right? As was evidenced by my pronunciation of other words that are not French or English or Spanish. But yeah, I felt like a 5-year-old child again reading some of those pronunciations. Nakane. Where was it? Yeah, never asked me out again. Yep. So we get a sense right at the end of this chapter. When I return to the classroom, I am in time to see Sigmund dashing for his desk from the blackboard where something has been erased. I assign the class free reading till bell time. By 5:30, I am on the road for Granton. Driving conditions are rather poor this evening. There's a drizzle of rain that is making the road slippery in places. It's taking me longer to drive down than it usually does, but I'm in no great hurry. But I'm not in a great hurry to see Obasan. So on the one hand, we get a reminder of the connection between uncle and water, land specifically. As he dies, it starts to rain. In a poorly written novel, that would just be cliche, right? Because it always rains when something bad happens, right? When it rains, it pours, that kind of thing. It was a dark and dreary evening, and so on. But here, at least, it fits in with the metaphor that had been established prior. But there's an irony that's being highlighted as well by that last sentence. Can anyone tell me what that is? I'm not in a great hurry to see Obasan. And this will make sense if you've actually looked up what Obasan means. And you may not have, which is totally fine. So for those of you who don't know, Obasan means two basic things in Japanese. And again, I know this purely from Dr. Google. It means, on the one hand, aunt, right? And it means an elder person that we respect, right? Or an elder woman that is respected. And so, from the perspective of the narrative, right, again, there's a bit of assumption going on. She never explicitly states that Obasan means aunt or respected person. Maybe she does in the rest of the novel, I forget. That we already see this schism that we were talking about earlier. Right? We often understand it as it's weird that you wouldn't be in some kind of hurry after death, or the death of a loved one, or why wouldn't you be in a hurry to see a family member? Usually we're close, or sometimes we're close to family members. Right? But it takes on another meaning of irony, at least in this particular situation, which I think is worth highlighting. But other than that, we also get this section here, which is interesting from a structural perspective in the novel. Why is that?
Because she's struggling with speaking too, just like her uncle.
Good. So as her uncle dies, literally loses the ability to speak, right? Because he is dead. She then takes on that particular phenomenon. right? Or that particular impediment, if you want to put it in that way, right? Where she says at the start here, I am aware that I cannot speak. I don't know if I have said goodbye to Dr. Brace. So on that front, but also, if we want to think of it in the terms that we've been establishing in class, when certain things begin and end, right? There's an argument to be made that this is what kicks off the actual action of the novel as well, right? The inciting incident, if you will. Right? The person who promised answers in the first chapter that kept insisting that she was too young has died and can no longer provide those answers, no matter how much she tries. Right? Unfortunately, divination is not real in this world. Right? So she cannot ask him anymore, which incites the whole action of actually finding out what Uncle wanted to tell her, but never felt comfortable enough to do. Do we all agree with that? That makes sense. It's not a very, this is not a hot take, I think, about the novel, so I would be very surprised if anyone has a disagreement with this one. Okay, I'll launch it back to you now, since I spoke for chapter 2. Anything in chapter 3 that we want to highlight? Talked about this. Sorry, I'm just looking through my notes to make sure.
I thought that chapter 3 was really interesting because it shows how she habitually, consistently shows up for her family, even though it's uncomfortable. And as I talked about in 3 or 4, that her brother just left because he couldn't deal with it.
Yes,
being around it.
I'm pretty sure it's in 3. Okay, so Stephen is mentioned at the end of chapter 2. That's for sure.
Yeah. It's talked about in the second last page of chapter 3. The bare density of her inner tree.
Yeah, there you go. Go ahead, you can read the rest of it.
Oh, okay. My brother will be of little help. Stefan, unable to bear the density of her inner retreat, and the rebuke he felt in her silences led to the ends of the earth. From London, he went to New York, to Montreal. Stefan has always been a ball of mercury, unpredictable in his moods and sudden rages. Departure for him is as necessary as breath.
Good. So actually, I should put it up here. There we go. For those of you who are following along, right there. So we immediately get this contrast between Naomi and Stephen, or Stefan, I don't know. One person who will drop everything in order to go to her family, no matter how awkward, as you said, Mel, and one person who will immediately leave. Reinforcing, it's no longer written on the board, but reinforcing the element of movement that we were talking about earlier. If anyone has ever seen a ball of mercury, right? Have you ever seen those videos of what a ball of mercury acts like? It's super slippery, and when it says unpredictable in its moves, if you see a ball of mercury, it just slips everywhere and just kind of ping pong balls, essentially. Which makes it very difficult to work with in a lab setting. But you also see, and again, this makes sense later in the novel when we learn more and more about Naomi's mother, right? But there's this kind of opposite effect with their mother going on. right? She leaves for Japan, right? Or she goes back to Japan for reasons that we find out. So there is that movement away from family. Okay? But the reasons why the mother does that are ultimately ones that we understand as readers, right, without revealing too much. Whereas Stephen's seems to be because he can't quite cope with the weight of the emotions. Which is also something that the mother does. She has difficulty coping with other things, but they're more reasonable than simply, I feel uncomfortable being around my family. So it sets up these really interesting dichotomies that the novel absolutely plays out. Okay, was there anything else you wanted, since you brought up Stephen, was there anything else that you wanted to add? No?
I mean, it's complicated because sure, he can't handle it and so he leaves, but like, why is it his responsibility to fix the uncomfortable stuff in the family? So like, you read this and you think that she's like a better person than Stephen, but also she's just more of a martyr, I guess, than Stephen.
Yeah, that's inevitably part of the difficulty of it being a first-person narrative, right? It is told from her perspective at the end of the day. So you do get that kind of distance from Stephen, but you're right. We might ask that question. Is it Stephen's responsibility to manage this story? Right? There's just what-ifs of stories, I guess, that we can enter into. Yes.
We had talked about earlier, like her relationship with her uncle being abnormal from like a standpoint, but to like so then moving further from that, it's also abnormal now that Stephen isn't stepping up into like the place of the man of the family, and
exactly. Yeah, very good. I think that makes more sense than saying. Not that saying it is a valid question. That's not true.
Helps with context, maybe.
Yeah, I think it contextualizes it a little bit. Again, today reading this, we maybe feel a little bit more uncomfortable because it's like 50 years have passed since, or almost 60 years since when this takes place, and our modern understandings of it. But I don't think it would be that much of a stretch to see that into the novel. Yeah. Yeah, what were you going to add?
Oh, I was gonna, I'm done with Stephen. I'm like, I don't want to.
No, it's fine. Does anyone else have anything to say about Stephen? I'm just going to look at my notes to make sure that I don't have anything highlighted for him. Oh, yeah, just to add on to that point. 3 years older than. Yeah. There's a sense from Stephen that you don't get from Naomi or Obasan or Uncle, where part of what comes with the acceptance of having to stay with the family and so on is also a certain form of respect. Whether it's actual respect or an obligation of respect for these traditions, you do get that from them. And I think this section here, towards the end of chapter 3, points to Stephen's more willingness to play fast and loose with those traditions or with that respect. If you can't even break it, it's not bread, I said, it's all stone. That's not how, Stephen said. He speared the loaf with a sharp knife point and handed me a clump. Matches your complexion. What, bristleface? Stephen was an early beginner when it came to hair on his face. He was the first boy in his class to shave. With Uncle gone now, there will be no more black bread and black bread jokes. So as soon as we get that first chapter where Naomi and Uncle are together and have this sense of bond, and as soon as he's gone, right, those bonds kind of collapse in on each other, and as soon as they meet, they're kind of at odds and playing with this awful sounding black bread. And I'm someone who eats a lot of different things, but black bread does not sound particularly appetizing for me. But yeah, that's, I think, the last thing I wanted to say about Stephen, at least for this chapter. Go ahead. What was your next point?
Just looking at it's actually a little bit before the Stephen paragraph, the language of her grief and silence.
Yeah,
She was worded it well. Like it kind of ties back to it again, like going silent and the lack of voice, but then also I guess taking that and then skipping ahead to her being old and like carrying and talking about she's barricades down the doorways, like it's like she holds the secrets, and then that also because we're talking about how like the jump start to the story was him passing.
Yeah.
So then like this is like the next step of like we gotta get the secrets from her.
Yes, exactly. We had talked about the bearer of keys part earlier, and now I forgot where it is.
The last page before chapter 4.
Last page before. Oh, sorry, I thought it was in chapter 4.
Like the last half
Yeah,
paragraph of 15 and then
right there. Yeah. So the silence as a language bit is interesting, and I think the idea of it kickstarting the next step ties in quite nicely. Emily, throughout, I think, both this excerpt that you read and in the novel more broadly, occupies this, to use a really academic term, liminal space, right? Which is probably a space, a term that you've heard increasingly. It's a kind of like an overused space term, but it basically means an in-between space, right? Is what that means. If you want to know more about that, apparently Backrooms is all about that. If you want to see that movie. But right, she occupies this middle space between Obasan, who's almost entirely silent, right? Especially at the beginning. She speaks in 2-3 words at a time. Sometimes just doesn't say anything. She just nods or does the action, right? So as silent as you can get.
She's very busy all the time.
She always occupies herself instead of speaking.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you see, you don't really get that sense, so that's why I'm telling you. As Emily in the novel is referred to a little bit later as a word warrior. She's someone who emphasizes language a lot. Right? So in this case, aunts take on these two poles in the book, and Naomi is stuck between the two. As someone who's clearly able to speak and verbalize, as demonstrated by the fact that she is a teacher, right? But there are certain situations in which she can't find the actual terms to express herself, or doesn't know how to express them in the particular context that she's been given. And so from a character arc perspective, if we want to use that term again, that is what she will be going through throughout the novel, is finding the terms and methods for that expression. I don't know if that's where you were thinking when you were talking about that, but that's where my mind went, and I think it's an important thing to highlight. I had highlighted that part of now old, everything is old, and I think yeah, okay, no, I think that's pretty much all I wanted. To add on to this part that we had started to get at when we discussed the overlap of Indigenous people and Japanese people and their history of displacement and reservations and spiritual connections, etc. You brought this up earlier and might as well talk about it now. Did anyone, in reading a passage like this, get a sense of, oh yes, I know exactly who this person is, right? Like I can imagine my own grandma? No? Okay, interesting. Because I could. Maybe it's because I have a very old grandmother, and she acts exactly like this. Right? There's this rather silent old lady who half hears everything you say to her and just occupies herself over time. Right? Who's just happy to be around activity more than actually engaging because she can no longer do that. Yeah.
You see, maybe I read it wrong, but she doesn't seem happy to me.
No, okay, well, my grandmother was happy in this, but in the sense of, sorry, but I meant like a small older woman who, in this case, no, you're right, is not particularly happy. I don't think you misread that at all. But there is a universalism to what Joy Kogawa is getting at, that even if it's not a 1-to-1 ratio, she is working with character tropes, I think, which adds on to this element of there are some historical overlaps, but also character overlaps that make it more relatable, right? Even if you don't know exactly a doddering old grandmother who is unhappy in her life. Sorry, you looked like you were going to add something. Okay.
Like the grandma in Moana.
The grandma in Moana. Has anyone seen the remake of it? No. Good. That's fine. We're going to end that conversation right there.
Not out yet, is it?
Didn't it come out?
I don't think so.
Or am I thinking of
July, maybe.
Okay.
Lilo and Stitch, maybe.
That's what I'm thinking of.
I refuse to watch that.
Needless cash grabs. But yeah, I'm looking at you, Mel, because you're the one who brought it up in the library earlier. But was there anything you wanted to add to that point of the grandmother?
I really like the line, "Everywhere the old woman stands is the true and rightful owner of the earth." I love that one. The matriarch.
Yeah. It kind of goes against what was said earlier about Uncle. Right? Uncle stands with his hand outstretched and seems to control the land. And then in this almost throwaway line, right, in between the rest of a paragraph, it's like, yeah, but there was someone behind that the entire time. Yeah. Which, of course, leads into the whole idea of bearer of keys, which thematically is what she is in the novel. Naomi thinks it's her uncle because that's who she has a relationship with, and that's why she keeps asking him the questions. But then the novel explicitly tells you, well, she's actually the bearer of the keys, right? She was asking the wrong person the whole time, right? And again, this is who you're going to have to, this is part of her kind of development as a character, is learning to ask the right questions and ask the right people those questions. Which is another way in which you can think of narrative. We didn't talk about it in that sense yesterday, but it's never a bad way of looking at stories to examine where characters get their information, right? You'll notice this pattern in a lot of fiction. This is not necessarily exclusive to contemporary literature in the context of this class, but the idea of seeking information in a particular area or asking certain people and learning to overcome those assumptions about where you would find information is a pretty prevalent trope as far as story structure is concerned. Yeah, this house, this body, everything is old. There was one last thing that I wanted to bring up in chapter 3. It was the bit at the start. Oh yeah, okay. I'm not going to read that whole part here, but I think this is a part that really got that really kickstarted some nostalgia memories of what my grandmother's house used to look like.
The plastic over the
plastic
tablecloth.
over everything. Like, I know we associate it with like a 70s type of aesthetic. I'm not that old that I was alive in the 70s. But my grandmother certainly was, and she kept that going for way too long, right? But what else do we get? Yeah, I'll just focus on this part. What else do we get from the specific mention of putting plastic and white tablecloth over everything? What does that point us to as far as a theme that we've phrased already? Or a new theme? You seem to.
Well, the tablecloth, like putting cloths over furniture, is like left the house for a long period of time, like you're protecting it from dust.
Right.
I feel like I'm missing the mark, though.
You're missing the mark only insofar as like that's what we use it today for.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a moment when it was super popular to do this during this time specifically, where you would just cover everything in plastic and just sit on it in your day-to-day life.
Careful preservation of the furniture.
Yeah.
To the detriment of your own lifestyle.
Hold on. I'm sure I can find like an awful image from home.
I'm thinking of like the mom from like Fran's mom from The Nanny. She has like plastic on her couch. But I can't think of her actually being mean beside not wanting to ruin furniture because it's cheap.
So part of it would be that, right? Is that mentality of not wanting to.
Great Depression.
Well, it's not that old, but of the Great Depression. But 1970s furniture, plastic. Hold on. No.
I know some people from Croatia, somebody who immigrated from Croatia who still does that.
Yeah.
And somebody who I knew in England who immigrated from Poland who still does that.
Oh, yeah, there we go. Right.
It's like a scarcity mindset.
It's a scarcity mindset, right? You preserve it. It's the equivalent of putting a bug in hamburgers, right? Or something. Not hamburgers. That's not what I'm thinking of. Hamburger. Sorry, not hamburgers. Right? Hamburgers is something else, right? But you want to preserve exactly as it is in a moment in time. For the grandmother I'm thinking of who's still alive, that was in the 70s when she bought most of that furniture. For my other grandmother, it was the 1940s, right? Even older. But there's this sense of not wanting to move away from what makes you comfortable, right? That is mirrored in these types of passages. Part of it makes sense, right? You're seeing a renewal of this movement for environmental reasons, right? Oh, don't throw out your couches if they're still good, and that's a valid thing. We're talking about something else here, right? This is not quite preservation for environmental sake. This is preservation for the aesthetic of keeping it nice and pristine, right? Literally shiny. The idea of a pristine and new couch rather than an actual couch that you benefit from. Because one thing these couches were is extremely uncomfortable. Right? No one wants to sit on plastic. It sucks. And it squeaks and it's awful. Anyway, that was my rant against plastic. Thank you for coming to class. All right. Anything else in chapter 3? There's one thing in particular that I wanted to bring up in chapter 4, and then we can move on to the last bit of the class. Okay. So in chapter 4, we get favorite segment of this class, which is the inclusion of what form of media? Photos! Yay! So, I love that you actually clapped. This was actually completely unintentional. When I planned out this class, I had no memory that so many of the actual stories used photographs as an image. So it's pure happenstance. I genuinely.
It was subconscious.
It was it must have been this book that I hadn't read in 15 years. No, 10 years. Regardless, right? Photographs show up, and you only get a sense of it here. So she finds a photo in Obasan, gives her a photo. Later, and this is not a segment that you get, Aunt Emily gives her a box of pictures as well. Right? It's one of the central images of the text. It just happens far enough in the text that I didn't want to include it in the excerpt, but I'm telling you now. So, two things of note. She spends a lot of time describing the actual picture, right? This person was there, and this is what I see. Which, to me, signified or immediately brought to mind what in literary studies we call an epic. Do we all know what I'm referring to, right? We've referred to some examples in this class. The Odyssey and the Iliad would be considered epics. But there's this trope in epic writing where you create a genealogy. Right? Famously in the Iliad, Homer spends pages upon pages talking about a ship's log, for example. Right? And you create this long list of characters that will stay with you. Or you establish a character's heritage by going back, right? They're son of this, son of this, son of this, daughter of this, etc., and so forth. Okay. And even if it's not qualified, rightfully so, as an epic, I think Kogawa is certainly channeling those conventions of highlighting a genealogy as part of a history that needs to be known for the characters, right? Because that was the point of that convention in the epic, was to demonstrate the history and knowledge of a culture. That's what epics served as a purpose. And so I think there's a little bit of a wink to that in her going on for so long about describing who's in this photograph and why are they important to me and my family. Question to you as a class. Think back to all the other photographs that we talked about. So we talked about it in relation to Finley's The Wars, where I mentioned that he performs a kind of ekphrasis, right, a description of the photographs and what they're meant to evoke, or what the archivist feels when seeing them. We got a bizarre version of that with Billy the Kid, where there are just empty boxes that pretend to be pictures, and the pictures happen in your mind. And then we get this, where each paragraph is one person, each with their own history. Think of the difference between all three of them for a second. How does this stand out from other descriptions of the photography that we've seen earlier? I'm looking for a particular passage that reminded me of this. Are we tired or genuinely finding nothing to say?
I'm trying to picture the other ones besides Billy the Kid one.
Yeah, it's a bit difficult to like.
I mean, it's more descriptive. So
It's more descriptive. Good.
it's not as theatrical.
Okay.
It's describing people they look like the other things.
When you say the other one.
Billy.
Good, good. I like that idea that it's more descriptive.
This one is really talking about how noble they all seem, with his cape and his cane and his gloves and looking like Napoleon.
Yeah. There's really an emphasis, I think, in this one compared to something like Finley's or like Ondaatje's text that emphasizes how this fills in the silences. This is expressing what Obasan can't. Because in Finley's, it complements what we're being told as a story. It adds on to it. Right? It's not necessarily that it's silent. We know about these people. We're just saying more. Right? Ondaatje's thing is entirely a fiction. Right? That's part of why there's no actual picture in the frame. Right? Because he wants you to engage in this as a story and go along for the ride. Here, people are literally refusing to talk about it, and the only way that it can be expressed is through an image. And suddenly we get a greater burst of description than pretty much any other point in the novel. Because usually you'd associate, right, an important character as being described. But Uncle's description gets 2 small paragraphs by comparison. And it's only a description by comparing him to another historical figure, right? He doesn't even get his own personality in that sense. Whereas all of these, because of the pictures, actually get descriptions. They break that silence. And you didn't get this passage, but of course that's going to be what kicks off once Emily gives Naomi the box of photos, right? It's what kicks off the opening of the door, right? The unveiling of those silences proper. Okay. We're tired and we have fewer and fewer things to say about this, it seems. I want to end on something specific. So this is not a spoiler for those of you who are planning on reading the text, but I do want to show you the last page, because I think it gets at a really interesting thing that Kogawa is trying to say. And remember, we have to imagine that this was published before the apology that we started the class with. Okay? This was published in 1981. And I'm just borrowing the book again. So the narrative proper ends on page 222 of the novel. And then you get a little bit more on this page here. Let's see if I can zoom in properly. Who can read this out loud for us, just to finish off? Sure.
I started from the memorandum sent by the Cooperative Committee on Japanese Canadians to the House and Senate of Canada, April 1946. It is urgently submitted that the orders in council for the deportation of Canadians of Japanese racial origin are wrong and indefensible and constitute a grave threat to the rights and liberties of Canadian citizens, and that Parliament, as guardian of these rights and the of the people should assert its powers and require the governor and council to withdraw the orders from the following reasons.
And then it goes on. Note the date. This is an actual historical document, by the way, right? She just reprints it. 1946. They actually go on to make explicit some of the things that we were talking about, that this is basically akin to what the Nazis were doing. Okay, so you were not entirely wrong when you were saying that, okay, well, the concentration camps and all that. Yeah, no, they talk about that explicitly in that document. Okay. So seeing something like this, what's your first reaction to why she would include this? And then I have something else that I'm going to add on to it. You see something like this at the end of the novel. Why do you think she would include something like this?
Impact.
Impact, certainly, right? From a narrative standpoint, it's just like a kick in the shins, right?
Context.
Context, good. Although she doesn't say it at the start that exists, so you would only find out after the fact.
She wanted to show that they had this event happened, and then they had asked for, but it's still ongoing and not satisfied. It's ongoing.
Good. The ongoing element of it, certainly. Right? Because we tend to think in those very like epochal ways. It happened and then it finished. No harm, no foul. Right? Not quite.
It's like a film about the missing and murdered Indigenous women, and the info at the end saying that it still happened, and here are the statistics right here.
Yep.
This year, it's still happening.
Exactly. Right. You get that in a bunch of documentaries or like stories that are based on real events. Yeah, absolutely. Right. Sorry, you looked like you were going to say something.
I just said like terms of living times.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Good. So there's always this sense of ongoingness. And then there's a second kick in the shins. The orders are directly in contradiction to line. Blah, 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 blah. Here's the Nazism thing, by the way. Respectfully submitted, James N. Finley, chairman, Andrew Bruin, Hugh McMillan. Do we know who these people are, by the way? I wouldn't expect you to, because they were all 100 years ago politicians.
Why does James M. Finley sound so familiar?
I don't know.
Because of Timothy Finley?
Maybe because of Timothy Finley, but yeah, I don't know. Do these sound like Japanese people, just on the surface of it? No.
Maybe they're like me.
Maybe, right there. No, you could look them up. They're not, right? Hugh McMillan, yeah, as you would expect. People like Hugh McMillan, for example, are from Scottish descent, and so on. So while at first we're like, ooh, right, an interesting historical document, and people were against it, and the very last words of the novel, right, 225 pages in, are a list of white guys.
The white man tell the history.
Yeah. Which in itself, like, the novel kind of disproves, right? Because she's adding to that history, right? Or she's, I guess, adding resolution or revolution to that history, albeit 40 years later, right? Or 35 at this point. Right? So while their intentions are certainly good, right? And I don't think anyone would disagree with them necessarily, right? That this is an awful thing that happened. Right? I'm not saying that they should be labeled as wrong, right? Just because of their status. That's not true at all. But it does end on an ironic note, right? That these people who are calling for justice for Japanese people also are representative of how these Japanese people don't have a voice for themselves in the government that they're petitioning. This would change shortly after, by the way. I think the first Japanese or Asian person, not that it's the same thing, but like a Japanese person in parliament would arrive, I think it was in the 70s. So still pretty far after, but, relatively soonish as far as history is concerned. I think he was a MPP from British Columbia, although I might be mixing up my historical people here. And so that's kind of her last note of the book, right? Remember this, but also change things. Just because I'm able to talk about this, and when I say I'm talking as like Joy Kogawa, but just because Kogawa is able to talk about this at the moment that she did, right, does not mean that it's solved as an issue. We don't have time for it necessarily, but that's one of the things that she brought up in the interview that I was going to show. The interviewer asks her, and this is in 1999, is it enough, right? Like, have we gone past it at this point? And in a very diplomatic fashion, to Joy Kogawa's credit, she's like, no, right? Of course not. Right? This is still a thing that, Asian communities face during COVID, for example, or, all kinds of evidence of systemic racism for other peoples all across the world. Lee, you had your hand up.
I was just like in Googling trying to answer that. But the quote, they actually only 2 years after this did they gain the right to vote.
Yes, right. That would make sense. Yeah. No, it doesn't make sense, but that tracks in my mind.
1957 was the first visible minority was Chinese Canadian.
In the House of Commons?
Yeah, House of Commons.
Okay, 57. Okay, earlier than I thought. Right. Yay. Right. I guess small victories in that sense. Any final thoughts on this? For the last 2 classes now, I've kept wanting to use pictures, and I keep forgetting these specific pictures. And I kept forgetting to actually bring them up, and now we're too far past the point when I talked about it to come back to it. So I'll try to shoehorn them in tomorrow. We'll see if it works. Probably not, actually. But anyway, tomorrow is our last class, formally speaking. So read the excerpt of Dion Brand's inventory that I put up. If you have time to read more of it, great. I'm sure you can find a copy online. It's considered a long poem, so even if it's divided up in sections, as you see, it's considered one long thing, right? So I just randomly cut it somewhere. And yeah, then on Thursday it'll be our review class. I'll remind you of this yesterday, but try to think of questions that you would want to ask for that review class. Okay, like things that you want, like a refresher on, or things that were unclear for the rest of the semester. Start thinking about that, because I can obviously talk for hours and hours on end without stopping, but if you have specific questions, then would be the time. We all good?
So you really won't consider the poetry thing?
No. I've already...
But do a bonus at the end. If you can memorize one stanza, that's not an exam. You can have
yeah, and then just to have you recite a stanza in front of the entire class, break up the entire
stanza of Paradise Lost.
Do you know?
If we could.
Giving you 2 days to memorize a stanza?
That's
That's not that bad. All right. Look, if you could, yeah, okay. Sure, fuck it. Why not? Sure. If you could recite one of the poems from the class or part of it, good for you. You'll have at least my I have not decided if it'll actually give a bonus point, but you'll at least have my respect because it is a very difficult thing to do.
English exam again. I was ready to
No, and I'm not going to replace the exam in its entirety because that's the kind of thing that I would have told you at the beginning of class. I find it a bit cheap to change it now at the end of the semester.
We're not even everybody's here.
Yeah, exactly.
Surprise!
Yeah, surprise.
You guys full of poems.
Yeah, and some people are genuinely sick and all of that, so I feel kind of uncomfortable doing that. Speaking of Paradise Lost, famous literary critic Harold Bloom was able to recite the entire thing. And by the way, for those of you who have never seen Paradise Lost, it is 12 books of poetry. It is hundreds of pages long.
And this knocks better than
English exams.
Honestly, same, but I'm not going to have you recite Paradise Lost to me because it would take 15 hours. So
I listened to an audiobook of it and I think it was 9 hours.
yeah, okay. Well, I'm still
But
not going to
still,
have you
9
listen.
hours of memorized is. That's like those people that memorize the whole Bible.
Yeah, no, honestly, it's genuinely shocking. Good for them. It's my dream eventually to be able to memorize a whole book of poetry like that.
Is it really?
I would say so.
It's a passive dream, but I'm not actually implementing it in any way, shape, or form as it stands. But maybe one day. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.